Hello and good evening, students. How are you all doing? Hope you all have liked the part 1 of the story The Great Stone Face 1. And you all must be very curious to know what has happened further, isn't it? So, today we are going to do The Great Stone Face 2 story, chapter 10. And it has been taken from your English NCERT book, Honeydew. Alright, class 8th. So, the writer of the story is Nathaniel Hawthorne. And students, in this story, first of all, let me tell you that this story, The Great Stone Face 2, is an extension of lesson 9, right? As I have told you. So, let me give you the introduction of the story. Ernest, we have seen that he was a very curious guy to know who is resembling, who resemble like that great stone face. Okay. Now, Ernest, a very simple and unnoticed boy, had grown up in this story. He had grown up to be an old man and with white hair, right? And all the years that brought him here were not useless because he had become so wise that the number of wise thoughts exceeded the number of white hair on his head, right? So he was not unpopular anymore. Many people came to see him, and the story tells us about one such poet born in the valley who had moved to distant cities but had come back to meet Ernest. And in the end of the story, we will see that the old prophecy gets fulfilled as they find the man who bore likeness of the great stone face. Now, students, in this story, we see that Ernest, he was a well known for his goodness. So we should always keep a good nature and we should be good with everyone. Okay, we should just spread love for mankind. He had very noble and wise thoughts in his head. But he himself thought that any other person was wiser and better than him. He was not that confident, okay, about himself. That person would have a likeness to the great stone face in the distance. Now, students, I am going to tell you the summary of the story of phase 2, alright, and then we'll switch on to the story. So, in The Great Stone Face 2 by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ernest, a very simple and unnoticed boy, had grown up to be an old man with white hair. All those years made him so wise and knowledgeable that distant men from cities came to visit him just to have a conversation with him. अगर आप अच्छी you will talk something wisely knowledgeable, then of course people will come to meet you, okay, to share their problems, to have suggestions from you, right? And so he also received he was also receiving them, the people, with gentleness and kindness. As he talked to people, his face would brighten and would shine upon others as he was a mild evening light. Right? The story then introduces us to another son of the valley who moved to distant cities, pouring them with his sweet music. Right? So he kept the great stone face alive in his poems. Okay. Ernest came to know about him and he read the poet's thoughts in his book. He wished the poet to be the likeness of the great stone face. When the poet came to know about Ernest, he expressed a strong desire to meet him. Thus, he comes back to the valley and asks Ernest to give him a night's shelter. They talked to each other. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle, and kind also. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. Upon being asked, the poet told him that he was the writer of the book Ernest was reading. He was only the writer. Okay, so when he told the book which Ernest has already read, and just see how lucky he is that he could even meet the writer. As soon as he heard this, Ernest compared the poet's features with that of the great stone face, and when they did not match, he became sad. Upon being asked, Ernest told the poet that when he read his book, he thought him to be the man that would fulfill the prophecy, but to his disappointment, he was not. The poet considered himself unworthy of bearing the resemblance to the great stone face, as he knew that although his thoughts were great and he had great dreams, but those had just remained dreams, and he himself lacked faith in his thoughts. So it was a ritual for Ernest to speak to his neighbors every evening to sunset in the open air. Both men went to the meeting place from where the great stone face was clearly visible. And as Ernest began speaking, he shared whatever he had in his mind and heart. His thoughts were so powerful since they were supported by a life full of good deeds. Those were not mere thoughts, but words of life. And you know how poets they use words, isn't it? So we know words are wonderful, isn't it? You can win the heart of anyone. The poet, as he listened, felt that the life and character of Ernest were a nobler form of poetry than he had ever written. His eyes were filled with tears as he realized never had he seen a man so kind, gentle, and sweet and wise as Ernest. Then suddenly, students, you know what happened? He noticed that the great stone face with the golden light of the setting sun upon it and mist around it. He noticed that it resembled the eyebrows of Ernest. When the poet compared Ernest's grand expression to the great stone face, he couldn't help but tell everyone that Ernest himself bore the likeness of the great stone face. Everyone agreed. Ernest, however, hoped for a man better and wiser than himself to come, bearing resemblance to the great stone face. So, students, you see that he was not having a firm faith in himself, isn't it? He was thinking that there might be another person who is more wiser, more knowledgeable, and more sensible, and resembling to that great stone face. Right? Now, we'll read the story, okay, in detail. I'll read and then I'll do the explanation paragraph wise. The years hurried on and brought white hairs upon the head of Ernest and made wrinkles across his forehead and furrows in his cheeks. He was an old man, but not in vain had he grown old. More numerous than the white hairs on his head were the wise thoughts in his mind, and Ernest had ceased to be obscure. Unsought for, undesired, had come his fame which so many seek. He had become famous beyond the limits of the valley. College professors and even the active men of cities came from far to see and converse with Ernest, and he received them with gentle sincerity and spoke freely with them of whatever came uppermost or lay deepest in his heart or their own. While they talked together, his face would brighten unawares and shines upon them as with a mild evening light. Now, students, let us see the difficult words. Furrows, they are the deep lines, okay, and vain it is in means useless. Ceased मतलब होता है बच्चों to bring to an end, right? Obscure means not well known. Unawares, unknowingly, right? So now I'll do the explanation. What happened? Many years passed, and Ernest was not now an old. He was now an old man. He was no more young. He was no more a small boy. He was now an old man with white hairs upon his head, wrinkles across his forehead, and deep lines on his cheeks. This is how a person looks when he becomes old. All the years that brought him to this stage were not useless, because he had become so wise that the number of wise thoughts exceeded the number of white hair on his head. He was not unpopular anymore. Although students undesired for, he received all the fame that many go after. In fact, he had become known outside the valley too, because of his deeds, because of his knowledge. Many active men from the cities, college professors, and people from far used to come to see him and have a conversation with Ernest. And he was also not getting frustrated. He was welcoming them with great sincerity and conversing them with the purest heart. Right, saying whatever came to his mind, or even he was sharing his deepest thoughts. As he talked to people, his face would brighten, that would shine upon others, as if he was a mild evening light. समझ रहे हो ना? With him being unaware of it. उसको नहीं मालूम था, है ना? लेकिन सच्चाई यही थी कि there was a shine on his face. All right. While Ernest had been growing old, God had granted a new poet to this earth. He too was a native of the valley, but had spent the greater part of his life in distant cities, pouring out his sweet music everywhere. Neither was the great stone face forgotten, for the poet had celebrated it in a poem. The songs of this poet found their way to Ernest. He read them after his customary toil, seated on the bench before his cottage door. As he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. Customary toil means usual work, right? So, as Ernest grew old with each year that passed by, right, he came to know about the poet who had come to this earth by the grace of God. And although the poet was a native of the valley, वो भी यहीं का रहने वाला था, he had spent most of his time in distant cities, blessing them with his music. ठीक है, तो he even kept the great stone face alive with his poems. Okay, he was writing poems, and he was also keeping his poems alive. His work, means the poet's work, made its way to Ernest, and after winding up his usual day's work, Ernest would read while sitting on the bench in front of his cottage door. So after reading the poems, Ernest would lift his eyes to glance at the great stone face. Next. "O great stone face," he said, "is not this man worthy to be your likeness?" The face seemed to smile, but did not answer. Now it happened that the poet, though he lived so far away, had not only heard of Ernest, but had thought much about his character, and wished to meet this man whose wisdom walked hand in hand with the noble simplicity of his life. One summer day, therefore, he arrived at Ernest's door, where he found the good man holding a book in his hand, which he read, and then, with a finger between the leaves, looked lovingly at the great stone face. So, students, as Ernest read the poet's works, he lifted his eyes so as to see the great stone face, and asked him if the poet was worthy of possessing its likeness. Okay, because he was very much inspired by the great stone face. So the mountain appeared as if it was smiling, but it did not reply. उसके लिए, उस बच्चे के लिए तो वो जो माउंटेन में जो फेस है वो हमेशा एक स्माइल देता रहता है ना, और वो चाहता है कि वो कुछ बोले भी, क्योंकि वो जो अर्नेस्ट है वो उससे हमेशा बहुत इंस्पायर्ड रहता है, राइट। नाउ on the other hand, although the poet lived far away from the valley, he very well knew about Ernest. ऐसा नहीं था कि वो उसके बारे में कुछ जानता नहीं था, वो अर्नेस्ट के बारे में सब कुछ जानता था. And put so much thought into his character that he wanted to meet Ernest, who was so wise yet simple in his way of living. So let's see what happened next. One fine day in summer, the poet showed up at Ernest's door, where he found Ernest reading a book as he glanced at the great stone face in between, with a finger between the leaves. "Good evening," said the poet. "Can you give a traveler a night's shelter?" Gladly answered Ernest, and then he added, smiling, "I think I never saw the great stone face." So, students, here in these lines, let me read more. Yes, "I think I never saw the great stone face look so hospitably at a stranger." The poet sat down beside him, and he and Ernest talked about together. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. And Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. So, here, students, the poet greeted Ernest by saying good evening and asked him to let him stay there for a night. और अर्नेस्ट भी मान गया. As the poet further said, with a smile on his face, that he had never seen the great stone face welcome a stranger so gently and kindly. The poet sat beside Ernest, and they conversed for a while. The poet had never had the chance of talking to a wise, gentle, and kind man like Ernest. While on the other hand, अर्नेस्ट को भी बहुत अच्छा लग रहा था, क्योंकि वो जिस पोएट से बात कर रहा था, है ना, वो उसकी वो बुक्स पढ़ता था, उनकी पोइट्रीज वो पढ़ता था. सो ही एज ही वॉज लिसनिंग टू द पोएट स्पीकिंग सो विविडली. नेक्स्ट, as Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the great stone face was bending forward to listen too. He gazed into the poet's eyes. "Who are you, my gifted guest?" he asked. The poet laid his finger on the book that Ernest had been reading. "You have read these poems," said he. "You know me then, for I wrote them." Wow. So this poet is the same poet whose poetries are read by Ernest. While Ernest listened to what the poet was saying, he visualized the great stone face bending to listen to him too. Okay, this is his imagination, students. ऐसा लग रहा है वो झुक करके सुन रहा है. As he looked into the poet's eyes, Ernest very politely asked who he was. The poet pointed at the book in Ernest's hand and told Ernest that if he had read this book, poet जो है उसके पास आकर के कह रहा है कि क्या आपने ये बुक पढ़ी है. जब वो उससे इंट्रोडक्शन पूछ रहा है तो वो उससे कह रहा है कि आपने बुक पढ़ी है. He would know him too, as he himself had written it. Again and again, Ernest examined the poet's features. He turned toward the great stone face, then back. He shook his head and sighed. "Why are you sad?" inquired the poet. "Because," replied Ernest, "all through life I have awaited the fulfillment of a prophecy, and when I read these poems, I hoped that it might be fulfilled in you." "You hoped," answered the poet. faintly smiling to find in me the likeness of the great stone face. I am not worthy to be its likeness. Students, what happened now that as soon as Ernest knew who the man was, sorry, he began noticing his features as he turned repeatedly towards the great stone face. Now, being disappointed, Ernest heaved a sigh. Upon being asked by the poet the reason behind his sadness, Ernest told him how he had waited all his life for the prophecy to come true, and now he is hoping that the poet would fulfill it when he read his poems. Bringing a faint smile upon his face, the poet replied that he is not worthy of bearing the resemblance of the great stone face. And why not? Asked Ernest. He pointed to the book. Are not those thoughts worthy? You can hear in them the distant voice of a heavenly song. But my life, dear Ernest, has not corresponded with my thoughts. I have had grand dreams, but they have been only dreams. Sometimes I lack faith in my own thoughts. Why then, pure seeker of the good and true, should you hope to find me in the face of the mountain? The poet spoke sadly and his eyes were wet with tears. So too were those of Ernest. Both are having tears in their eyes. So, students, here Ernest asked the poet why he didn't consider himself and his thoughts so beautifully articulated in his books to be worthy of it. है ना? वो अपने आप को ही क्यों नहीं मानता है? Great stone face. The poet replied that he was aware that his thoughts recite a distant voice of a heavenly song, but his life had not been in congruence with his thoughts. He confessed that he had seen huge dreams, but they have remained only dreams, as he often lacked faith in his own thoughts. The poet further asked why a man like Ernest, who was the constant portrayal of goodness and truth, would see the resemblance of the great stone face in the poet. वो खुद ही तो इतना महान है, तो मुझ में इतनी महानता उसको कहाँ से दिख रही है? And the poet said all of it in a sad tone, and his eyes were filled with tears. और अर्नेस्ट की आंखों में भी आंसू थे. At the hour of sunset, as had long been his custom, Ernest was to speak to a group of neighbors in the open air. Together he and the poet went to the meeting place, arm in arm. From there could be seen the great stone face. तो क्या होता है बच्चों कि नाउ अर्नेस्ट हैड अ हैबिट ऑफ स्पीकिंग टू हिज नेबर्स एट द आवर ऑफ सनसेट इन ओपन एयर. दिस ही वॉज डूइंग एवरी डे. ओके, सो देयरफॉर ही एंड हिज गेस्ट वेंट टू द मीटिंग प्लेस आर्म इन आर्म. इतने अच्छे फ्रेंड्स कि दे वर गोइंग आर्म इन आर्म. द ग्रेट स्टोन फेस वॉज ऑल्सो विजिबल फ्रॉम द मीटिंग प्लेस. जहाँ भी उनकी मुलाकात हो रही थी बाकी सब उनसे लोगों से, he was having a habit of speaking to his neighbors ना, तो वहाँ से भी वो great stone face दिखता था. Next, Ernest threw a look of familiar kindness around upon his audience. He began to speak to the people what was in his heart and mind. His words had power because they agreed with his thoughts. And his thoughts had reality and depth because they harmonized with the life which he had always lived. It was not mere breath that the preacher uttered, they were the words of life. A life of good deeds and selfless love was melted into them. The poet, as he listened, felt that the life and character of Ernest were a nobler strain of poetry than he had ever written. His eyes filled with tears, and he said to himself that never there so worthy a sage as that mild, sweet, thoughtful face with the glory of white hair diffused about it. Harmonized मतलब बच्चों होता है, हार्मोनाइज्ड मतलब करस्पॉन्डेड विद मतलब एग्रीड विद, ठीक है. सेज इज मीन्स वाइज मैन एंड डिफ्यूज्ड मीन्स स्प्रेड ऑल अराउंड. नाउ देखो क्या होता है कि एज ही बिगैन स्पीकिंग टू हिज ऑडियंस, अर्नेस्ट radiated familiar kindness upon them. He spoke whatever came to his heart and mind, as he was always doing. His words had a unique power because they corresponded with his thoughts, and his thoughts were deep and practical because they resonated with how he had always lived his life. He did not just preach but shared words of life, words that were filled with love and supported by a life spent on good deeds. As the poet heard Ernest speak, he thought to himself that the life story and personality of Ernest was in itself a form of poetry, something he had never written. और इसीलिए उसकी आंखों में आंसू आ गए. As he heard Ernest that and he thought to himself, now he had never crossed paths with a man so wise, itna kind, itna gentle, with a thoughtful face that had the glory of white hair spread around it. Let's see the last paragraph of this story. At a distance, but clearly to be seen, high up in the golden light of the setting sun appeared the great stone face with white mist around it, like the white hairs around the brow of Ernest. At that moment, Ernest's face took to an expression so grand that the poet was moved to throw his arms up and shout, behold, behold, Ernest is himself the likeness of the great stone face. Students, it is very touching part. Although a few miles away, the great stone was clearly visible from their meeting point. Okay, the golden light of the sundown fell upon it along with mist that covered it, just like the white hair around Ernest's brow. और उसी समय Ernest's grand expression was such that when the poet compared it with the great stone face, he couldn't control himself as he threw his arms in the air and shouted, behold, behold, to draw everyone's attention to the fact that Ernest is the likeness of the great stone face. So you see that person, है ना, Ernest was himself the great stone man. He was having that face, okay, and all the means the confidence, the means the self confidence which he was lacking was recognized by the poet in the end. I hope you all like the story. Thank you very much and have a nice day.